November 15th, 1944. The makeshift field hospital outside Tacloban Leyte buzzed with desperate activity as American medics struggled against an enemy more insidious than any Japanese soldier: infection. General Douglas MacArthur's chief medical officer, Brigadier General Albert Henderson, lay fevering on a canvas cot, his left leg swollen to twice its normal size from a wound that refused to heal despite every modern treatment available to the most advanced military in the world. The American Medical Corps, armed with the latest sulfur drugs and surgical techniques, watched helplessly as their commanding officer's condition deteriorated hour by hour. Little did they know that salvation would come from the most unlikely source imaginable: a Japanese civilian prisoner whose ancient knowledge would challenge everything they believed about modern medicine. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how traditional wisdom triumphed over technological superiority, transforming not just one man's life, but forever changing the relationship between captor and captive in the most unexpected corner of the Pacific Theater. The field hospital represented the pinnacle of American military medicine in 1944. Rows of canvas tents stretched across the muddy ground, each equipped with the most advanced medical equipment the United States could produce. Portable X-ray machines, donated by General Electric, hummed alongside sterilization units that could process 500 surgical instruments per hour. The pharmaceutical inventory included over 200 different medications. From the revolutionary penicillin, still so precious that only 700,000 units were allocated to the entire Pacific Theater, to the newer sulfonamide compounds that had already saved thousands of American lives. Dr. James Morrison, Henderson's primary physician, reviewed the general's chart with growing frustration. Morrison had graduated top of his class from Johns Hopkins Medical School in 1938, served his residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, and had already performed over 400 combat surgeries since arriving in the Philippines 3 months earlier. His credentials were impeccable, his experience extensive, yet he found himself completely baffled by Henderson's condition. The wound itself appeared simple enough: a laceration on the left shin caused by shrapnel from a Japanese mortar round that had struck near the command post 6 days earlier. The injury measured approximately 4 inches long and penetrated roughly half an inch deep, well within the normal parameters for routine treatment. Morrison had cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied sulfanilamide powder according to standard protocol, and administered 100,000 units of penicillin intramuscularly every 6 hours. Yet instead of healing, the wound had become a gateway for systemic infection. Henderson's temperature fluctuated between 103 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. His white blood cell count had risen to 18,000 per cubic millimeter, nearly double the normal range. Most alarming of all, red streaks had begun appearing along his leg, following the lymphatic channels toward his groin, a clear sign that the infection was spreading despite all medical intervention. Morrison consulted with every specialist available in the theater. Colonel Patricia Williams, the chief nurse and a specialist in wound care, had tried every dressing technique in the military manual. Major Robert Chen, a surgeon who had studied tropical medicine at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, suspected some unknown local pathogen, but could identify nothing unusual in the wound cultures. Captain David Rodriguez, a pharmacologist attached to the Medical Corps, had even experimented with drug combinations not yet approved for field use. Nothing worked. If anything, Henderson's condition continued to deteriorate. Meanwhile, in a secured area approximately 200 yards from the main hospital, Allied forces maintained a temporary holding facility for civilian prisoners awaiting processing. The facility housed 47 Japanese civilians captured during the liberation of Leyte, including government officials, teachers, and medical personnel who had remained behind when Japanese military forces retreated deeper into the island's mountainous interior. Among these prisoners was Akiko Tanaka, their 53-year-old woman whose presence in the facility resulted from a case of mistaken identity that would prove fortuitous for everyone involved. Tanaka had been working as a translator for the Japanese administrative office in Tacloban when American forces arrived, but she was actually a Korean woman who had been conscripted for civilian service 2 years earlier. Her real background, unknown to her captors, included 15 years of study under traditional Korean healers in rural villages outside Seoul. Tanaka's knowledge represented an unbroken chain of healing wisdom that stretched back over 8 centuries. Her grandmother had been a mudang, a traditional Korean shaman who specialized in herbal medicine and spiritual healing. From the age of 12, Tanaka had accompanied her grandmother on collecting expeditions through the Korean mountains, learning to identify over 300 different medicinal plants and their specific applications. She had studied the ancient texts, memorized the traditional formulas, and most importantly, learned the subtle art of observation that allowed traditional healers to see patterns invisible to those trained in Western medicine. The irony was profound. The American medical establishment, backed by industrial pharmaceutical production worth over $2 billion annually, and research facilities that employed over 15,000 scientists and doctors, found itself helpless against an infection that a traditionally trained Korean woman could have treated with materials available within walking distance of the hospital. But language barriers, cultural prejudices, and military protocol created seemingly insurmountable obstacles between problem and solution. Tanaka spoke minimal English, and none of the American personnel spoke Korean or Japanese. More fundamentally, the very suggestion that a prisoner, particularly an Asian civilian, might possess medical knowledge superior to American doctors would have seemed absurd to most military personnel in 1944. The breakthrough came through the most mundane of circumstances, laundry duty. As Henderson's condition worsened on the morning of November 20th, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American nurse from San Francisco, was supervising a work detail of civilian prisoners assigned to wash medical linens. Chen had volunteered for this assignment partly because she hoped her own Asian heritage might help her communicate with the prisoners, though she spoke only Cantonese and had little success establishing meaningful dialogue. Chen noticed that Tanaka consistently separated certain stained fabrics from others, washing them in a different sequence and hanging them in specific patterns to dry. When Chen approached to investigate, Tanaka gestured toward the blood-stained surgical gowns and bandages, pointing to different stains and making distinctions that seemed significant but incomprehensible to the American nurse. Through a combination of gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the few English words Tanaka had learned, a remarkable conversation began to emerge. Tanaka was trying to explain that different types of wounds produced different types of stains, and that these differences indicated specific healing requirements that weren't being addressed by standard American procedures. Chen realized that Tanaka was demonstrating medical knowledge that might be relevant to the general's mysterious condition. Despite the potential career risks of involving a prisoner in medical decisions, Chen felt compelled to explore this possibility further. That evening, Chen approached Dr. Morrison with her observations. Morrison's initial reaction was exactly what might be expected from a Johns Hopkins-trained physician, confronted with the suggestion that traditional Asian medicine might succeed where modern American treatment had failed. He dismissed the idea as superstitious nonsense, pointing out that American medical science had produced the most effective military medical corps in history, with casualty survival rates that exceeded those of any previous conflict. However, as Henderson's condition continued to deteriorate over the next 2 days, Morrison found himself reconsidering options he would have rejected under normal circumstances. Henderson's fever now peaked at 106 degrees, and the infection had spread to the point where amputation was being seriously discussed. The general's wife had been notified that his condition was critical, and MacArthur himself had requested hourly updates on Henderson's status. On November 22nd, Morrison made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. He asked Chen to arrange for him to observe Tanaka's wound assessment techniques, with the understanding that this was purely for educational purposes and would not influence Henderson's actual treatment. What Morrison witnessed challenged every assumption he held about medical diagnosis. Tanaka examined several patients in the hospital, spending long minutes studying not just their wounds, but observing their breathing patterns, examining the color and texture of their skin, and even smelling the air around their injuries. She made distinctions between what appeared to be identical conditions, categorizing infections into types that had no equivalent in Western medical terminology. When Chen showed Tanaka a sample of fluid drained from Henderson's wound, the Korean woman's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She recoiled from the sample, covered her nose, and began speaking rapidly in Korean while making urgent gestures. Through painstaking translation work involving drawings and demonstrations, Tanaka managed to communicate that Henderson's infection belonged to a specific category that required immediate treatment with what she called mountain water medicine, a treatment that would need to be prepared from bamboo. Morrison's scientific training warred with the desperate reality of Henderson's deteriorating condition. Every rational part of his mind rejected the idea that bamboo could succeed where penicillin had failed. Yet he found himself asking Chen to help him understand exactly what Tanaka was proposing. The treatment Tanaka described required fresh bamboo shoots of a specific age and size, harvested at a particular time of day when the internal pressure was at its peak. The bamboo needed to be from plants growing in rocky, well-drained soil, rather than the swampy varieties common near the coastal areas where the hospital was located. Most importantly, the preparation required a complex process of extraction and concentration that bore no resemblance to any pharmaceutical procedure Morrison had ever encountered. Tanaka explained through gestures and drawings that the infection afflicting Henderson was caused by what Western medicine would call an anaerobic bacterial invasion. Bacteria that thrived in the absence of oxygen and produced toxins that prevented normal healing. These bacteria, according to traditional Korean medicine, required treatment with compounds that could only be extracted from bamboo under very specific conditions. The science behind this approach, though Tanaka could not articulate it in Western scientific terms, was actually quite sophisticated. Bamboo contains a variety of natural antibiotics, including bamboo-kun, a substance that shows significant activity against antibiotic-resistant bacteria. More importantly, the extraction process Tanaka described would concentrate these compounds while preserving their molecular structure in ways that industrial pharmaceutical processes could not replicate. But Morrison knew none of this biochemistry in 1944. All he saw was a desperate situation and a possible solution that defied everything he had been taught about proper medical practice. The decision to attempt Tanaka's treatment came down to a simple calculation. Henderson was dying despite the best efforts of American medicine, and conventional options had been exhausted. Morrison convinced Colonel Williams to authorize the experiment, framing it as a last resort when amputation seemed inevitable. On the morning of November 24th, Tanaka led a small party including Morrison, Chen, and 2 enlisted men into the hills, approximately 3 miles inland from the hospital. The Korean woman moved through the tropical vegetation with the confidence of someone who had spent decades reading the subtle signs that indicated which plants possessed healing properties and which were merely ornamental. The bamboo grove Tanaka selected appeared identical to dozens of others they had passed, but she insisted that only these particular plants would produce the medicine Henderson required. The bamboo stood approximately 20 feet tall, with stems roughly 4 inches in diameter. Tanaka circled each plant carefully, examining the color and texture of the bark, the pattern of the joints, and even the sound the stems made when tapped gently. She selected 7 specific stems, each harvested at a precise point, approximately 18 inches from the ground. The cutting had to be done with a sharp blade in a single stroke to prevent contamination, and the severed ends were immediately sealed with clay to preserve the internal pressure. Tanaka insisted that the bamboo be transported to the hospital without being jostled or exposed to direct sunlight. The preparation process began immediately upon their return. Tanaka split each bamboo stem lengthwise, revealing the hollow interior filled with a clear, slightly viscous fluid. This liquid, she explained through Chen's increasingly fluent translation, contained the healing compounds in their most potent form. However, the raw bamboo water was too weak to treat Henderson's severe infection and required concentration through a process that took nearly 6 hours to complete. Using equipment improvised from hospital supplies, Tanaka created what was essentially a primitive distillation apparatus. The bamboo water was heated in a series of metal basins, with the steam captured and condensed through a system of tubes and containers. The temperature had to be controlled precisely. Too hot, and the active compounds would be destroyed. Too cool, and the concentration would remain insufficient. Throughout this process, Morrison watched with fascination as Tanaka demonstrated knowledge of chemical processes that would not be formally understood by Western science for another decade. She knew intuitively how to separate different molecular compounds based on their boiling points, how to preserve pH balance during heating, and how to recognize the exact moment when optimal concentration had been achieved. The final product was approximately 2 ounces of clear liquid that bore no resemblance to any medicine Morrison had ever encountered. It had no characteristic pharmaceutical smell, no distinctive color, and no obvious therapeutic properties that could be identified through conventional analysis. Yet Tanaka radiated confidence that this simple preparation would succeed where the most advanced antibiotics had failed. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he prepared to administer the bamboo extract to Henderson. The general's condition had continued to worsen during the day-long preparation process. His fever had spiked to 107 degrees, and the infection had spread to the point where red streaks were visible from his ankle to his hip. The medical staff had prepared for emergency amputation, with surgical instruments sterilized and blood supplies standing ready. The application process itself was startlingly simple. Tanaka instructed Morrison to clean the wound thoroughly with saline solution, then apply the bamboo extract directly to the infected tissue using sterile gauze pads. The affected area was then covered with fresh bamboo leaves that had been boiled and cooled to create a natural dressing. No oral medication was required, no injections administered, no complex surgical intervention attempted. Henderson was conscious enough to consent to the experimental treatment, though his condition had deteriorated to the point where he was lucid only intermittently. Morrison explained that they were trying an unconventional approach based on traditional medicine, and Henderson agreed with the fatalistic acceptance of a man who understood that conventional options had been exhausted. The immediate response was unremarkable. Henderson's temperature remained elevated, the wound showed no obvious change, and the infection markers in his blood remained dangerously high. Morrison began to question his decision to attempt what suddenly seemed like a desperate and unscientific gamble with a man's life. But Tanaka urged patience, explaining through Chen that traditional treatments work differently than Western medicines. Where antibiotics attacked bacteria directly and immediately, bamboo medicine worked by strengthening the body's natural healing processes and creating conditions where infection could not survive. The effects would be gradual, but ultimately more complete than pharmaceutical intervention. 18 hours after the initial application, subtle changes began to appear. Henderson's fever dropped from 107 to 105 degrees. Not dramatic, but the first significant improvement in over a week. More importantly, the angry red color around the wound began to fade slightly, suggesting that the inflammatory response was finally moderating. By the morning of November 26th, the transformation was undeniable. Henderson's temperature had fallen to 102 degrees, the lowest it had been since the infection began. The wound itself showed clear signs of improvement, with healthy pink tissue beginning to appear at the edges where only inflamed, necrotic flesh had been visible before. Most remarkably, the red streaks that had tracked up Henderson's leg were visibly fading, indicating that the systemic infection was retreating. Morrison documented every detail of Henderson's recovery with the meticulous attention of a man who knew he was witnessing something that would fundamentally change his understanding of medicine. The general's white blood cell count began dropping toward normal ranges. The wound drainage decreased dramatically and changed from the purulent, foul-smelling discharge that had characterized the infection to the clear, minimal secretions associated with healthy healing. Within 72 hours of the bamboo treatment, Henderson was sitting up in bed, taking solid food, and discussing his return to duty. The wound that had threatened his life was healing normally, requiring only routine dressing changes and basic wound care. Morrison's laboratory tests confirmed what was obvious to clinical observation. The infection had been completely eliminated, but the story's most profound impact went far beyond Henderson's individual recovery. Word of the miraculous healing spread throughout the medical corps, reaching senior command levels within days. The implications were staggering. If traditional Asian medicine possessed knowledge that could succeed where modern Western medicine failed, what other medical wisdom was being overlooked due to cultural prejudices and professional arrogance? Morrison began documenting Tanaka's medical knowledge systematically, working with Chen to translate and record traditional Korean healing techniques that had been passed down through generations. They discovered that Korean traditional medicine possessed sophisticated understanding of bacterial infections, wound healing, and pharmaceutical preparation that complemented rather than contradicted modern medical science. More importantly, the success of Henderson's treatment began to change the relationship between American medical personnel and their Asian prisoners. Tanaka was transferred from the civilian detention facility to a special assignment within the medical corps, where she worked alongside American doctors to develop hybrid treatment protocols that combined traditional knowledge with modern facilities. The impact extended beyond medicine into broader questions about cultural superiority and the assumptions that shaped American policy in occupied territories. If Asian civilians possessed valuable knowledge that could benefit American forces, what did that say about the wisdom of dismissing entire cultures as inferior or backward? Henderson himself became an advocate for integrating traditional medicine into military medical protocols. Upon his return to duty in December, he initiated a comprehensive study of indigenous healing practices throughout the Pacific Theater, recognizing that local medical knowledge could provide crucial advantages in treating tropical diseases and conditions that American doctors encountered rarely in their homeland practice. The study revealed remarkable discoveries. Filipino healers possessed sophisticated techniques for treating fungal infections that thrived in tropical climates. Traditional Indonesian medicine included effective treatments for dengue fever and other vector-borne diseases. Vietnamese folk medicine had developed protocols for treating nutritional deficiencies and digestive disorders that were common among soldiers operating in jungle environments. By war's end, the military medical corps had established formal protocols for identifying and evaluating traditional healing practices in occupied territories. Medical officers were trained to recognize potential therapeutic value in local customs and to work with indigenous healers rather than dismissing their knowledge automatically. Tanaka remained with the American Medical Corps throughout the remainder of the conflict, eventually becoming an unofficial advisor on traditional healing practices for the entire Pacific Theater. Her bamboo treatment was refined and standardized, becoming part of the official medical manual for treating antibiotic-resistant infections. Post-war analysis revealed that her treatment had succeeded because bamboo extracts contained natural compounds that were effective against specific bacterial strains common in tropical environments, compounds that would not be synthesized artificially until the 1960s. But perhaps the most important transformation was in the individuals involved. Morrison returned to civilian practice after the conflict with a fundamentally changed approach to medicine. He established one of the first integrative medical clinics in the United States, combining Western scientific methods with traditional healing practices from cultures around the world. His work contributed to the development of what would eventually become complementary and alternative medicine as a recognized medical discipline. Chen parlayed her translation work and cultural bridge building into a career as a medical anthropologist, documenting traditional healing practices from Asia that were disappearing as modern medicine spread throughout the region. Her research preserved knowledge that would have been lost forever, as traditional practitioners died without passing their wisdom to younger generations trained exclusively in Western medical techniques. Henderson's experience with traditional medicine shaped his post-war career in ways that extended far beyond personal healing. As a senior medical administrator, he championed research into natural pharmaceuticals and supported funding for studies of indigenous medical knowledge. His advocacy contributed to the development of numerous modern medications derived from traditional plant-based treatments. Most remarkably, Henderson and Tanaka maintained correspondence for over 30 years after the war ended. Their letters, preserved in the National Archives, reveal a friendship that transcended cultural boundaries and historical circumstances. Henderson visited Korea 3 times during the 1950s and 60s, studying traditional medicine in its cultural context and supporting efforts to preserve traditional knowledge alongside the rapid modernization of Korean society. Tanaka eventually returned to Korea, where she established a clinic that combined traditional Korean medicine with modern diagnostic techniques. Her work became a model for integrative medicine throughout Asia, demonstrating how traditional and modern approaches could complement rather than compete with each other. She trained hundreds of practitioners in techniques that preserved cultural knowledge while meeting contemporary scientific standards. The broader impact of their story resonated throughout the post-war period as America grappled with its role as a global power responsible for governing diverse populations with different cultural traditions. The success of traditional medicine in treating Henderson's condition became a powerful argument for approaching occupied territories with humility and respect for local knowledge rather than assumptions of Western superiority. Military medical protocols developed during this period emphasized cultural sensitivity and the importance of learning from local populations rather than simply imposing American methods and assumptions. These approaches proved valuable not only in medical contexts but in broader efforts to establish productive relationships with civilian populations in occupied territories throughout Asia and the Pacific. The scientific understanding of bamboo's medicinal properties advanced significantly during the post-war period, as researchers sought to understand why Tanaka's treatment had succeeded where modern antibiotics had failed. Analysis revealed that bamboo contains over 200 different chemical compounds, many with significant antimicrobial properties. The traditional extraction process Tanaka had used concentrated these compounds while preserving their biological activity in ways that industrial processing could not replicate. This research contributed to the development of numerous modern pharmaceuticals derived from natural sources. The understanding of how traditional preparation methods preserved and concentrated active compounds influenced pharmaceutical manufacturing techniques, leading to more effective medications for treating antibiotic-resistant infections. By the 1970s, Henderson's case had become a standard teaching example in military medical schools, illustrating the importance of maintaining open minds toward unconventional treatment approaches. Medical officers were taught to evaluate traditional practices based on their effectiveness rather than their adherence to Western scientific paradigms. The story also became part of broader discussions about cultural competence in medical practice. As American medicine became increasingly diverse during the post-war period, Henderson's experience served as a reminder that effective healing often required understanding and respecting different cultural approaches to health and illness. In 1984, 40 years after his miraculous recovery, Henderson attended a conference on integrative medicine, where he publicly credited Tanaka's bamboo treatment with saving not only his life, but opening his mind to the possibility that healing wisdom existed in many forms and many cultures. His speech, delivered to an audience of American and Asian medical professionals, emphasized that true medical advancement required combining the best insights from all healing traditions rather than privileging any single approach. Tanaka, though unable to attend the conference due to her advanced age, sent a message that was read to the assembled doctors and researchers. She emphasized that traditional medicine had never been intended to replace modern medical science, but to complement it, providing insights and techniques that could enhance rather than compete with contemporary medical practice. The bamboo treatment that had saved Henderson's life became the subject of extensive research during the 1980s and 90s as pharmaceutical companies sought to develop new antibiotics based on traditional plant medicines. While synthetic versions of bamboo's active compounds were eventually developed, researchers found that the traditional preparation method still produced superior results for certain types of infections, particularly those involving antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.